how people should read and use my research on contagion? That's a very good question. Two parts. Clearly, one is about regulation and prudential regulation. So more than regulation is be prepared. No? So one is clearly about being prepared for the crisis and how to prepare for the crisis. And I think that lies more on the responsibility of governments, the central banks, the IMF, the World Bank, those multilateral institutions. On the private sector, the readiness to some of these events mostly come from adjusting your portfolio and your investments to hedge against those risks. So nowadays, for example, if you are a company in Brazil that you have a lot of debt in dollars, I will be actually restructuring that really fast. In fact, I think you're late. You should have restructured that last year. But my point is that when you look at these events of contagion, truly what they should point or should affect the way organizations decide or make decisions is about the readiness to one of these crises. So banks are important, and very large corporations, for example, that they are borrowing internationally or have international transactions that are meaningful, thinking about this crisis and how it will propagate, it should play a very important role in their planning and in the preparation of that firm. I think it has less impact on investment. Investment is mostly driven about, when I mean investment, I mean real greenhouse investment, that you actually build a plant. I think that has less to do with short-term issues. But how to hedge that exposure is quite important. And I think that's where the research should have an impact. Who is vulnerable to the risks that we have this year, especially in the emerging markets? I think that I will point out to three characteristics. First, is the country exposed to China risk? So because China is going to have problems. The second dimension will be if the country borrows in US dollars. And in a second I will explain why. And the third one will be is if the country has a current account deficit. And a current account deficit means that the country needs to borrow in the future. So let me go in reverse order. The first to the third, current account deficit. The United States is increasing interest rates, and throughout this year and the following year, it's going to be increasing the interest rate. So countries that need to borrow are going to face much tighter international financial market conditions. So it would be bad for their countries. That's one effect. In terms of their why borrowing dollars will be bad, it's kind of the same reason. The United States, when you look at the developed world, the United States is the country that is in better shape. So if something's going to happen is that the dollar is going to strengthen the next 2 to 3 years. So if I have debt in dollars, I have the debt in the currency that is becoming more strong, which means that it's a balance sheet loss. So you will be much better off borrowing in yens. So and lastly, the big shock that is going to move the world is how China is going to slow down and reinvent itself. But for the next 2 years, it's a slowdown and the realization of that slowdown. So a country like Brazil is in very bad shape because they export a lot of commodities to China. They have a current account deficit, so they need to borrow internationally. And most of the time when they borrow in dollars. So that's a country that is their macroprudential regulation and their macroprudential choices have been relatively poor. Let me put it, that's in a nice way. A country like Mexico, for example, Mexico is mostly exposed to US demand. So you see, for them, this is going to be good news in the future. They have a very small current account deficit, so they have had the need to borrow very little in the previous 5 years, and they have borrowed in dollars. That's the only part. So they still are exposed on one of those, but not. But then you have a country like Czech Republic that when you do the same analysis, well, the Czech Republic just passes perfectly that analysis. So who is going to be exposed, I think, they have not paid attention to the channels of contagion. What I just described are 3 channels of contagion. You see? One is through the demand of China. The other one is coming from interest rates increases, and the other one is coming from the need to borrow in a tighter financial market. So So the way I look ahead in the emerging market is said who's exposed are those that have used or misused these channels of contagion, and I think that that's how the propagation is going to take place.